Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion on debunking AI myths in HR, how to safely integrate within your people team. Today, you're going to hear from three perspectives because AI decisions in HR are never just owned by one function alone. So, I'm going to introduce myself and then ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves as well. My name is Hollis Baker. I'm a product marketing manager here at Tilt and excited to join you all for moderating this discussion. I'm going to pass it off to Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Zimmerman. I am the CTO at Tilt.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Nolan. I'm head of security and IT at Tilt.
Hey, everybody. I'm Bernard Coleman. I am a people operations leader at a company called Descript, which is an AI video editing tool.
And thanks for being here, Bernard. You're our special guest. So we're excited to talk to you. Each of us is really going to come from a different perspective in this conversation. Bernard, being in HR, is really going to represent the person who ultimately owns employee trust. Lisa, as our CTO, is going to represent what the technology actually does, and just as importantly, what it doesn't do, which I think we're all excited to get into. And Brian is going to represent those really critical guardrails that prevent a risk from becoming a regret. So let's get into a couple key pieces of our agenda today. We're going to break down this conversation into three different sections. First, we're going to be debunking some common AI myths in HR, which I know you're all excited for. Then we're going to be talking solutions, specifically by talking about the human checkpoint model and giving you all some advice and resources to further explore what that can look like at your organization. And finally, we're going to take a look at how HR teams are safely integrating AI today, followed lastly by our Q&A section. So if you have any questions during this event, please feel free to submit them in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to them in our Q&A section or follow up with you after the webinar. So let's get into our first point. Before we start talking about common hesitations around AI, it's really important to understand why these concerns are even showing up in the first place. We know that for about 60% of HR leaders, the biggest area of concern around implementing AI is lack of trust. And that's followed by a worry about understanding AI's true risk and value. And even though about 82% of teams are currently using AI in one way or another, only about 30% of HR people have any kind of job-specific training on how to actually use it well. So we're hearing a lot about AI, but people really don't know how to operationalize it. So Bernard, I want to start with you. When HR leaders say they're uncomfortable with AI, what are they actually worried about in your experience?
That's a great question. I think HR leaders, they do recognize the value of AI. There's incredible productivity gains that you can get from AI, but there's a tension that I would say is attention more so than worry in how AI is used, because I think the implications are vast from what I've seen so far. There's the ethics of usage. There's the risk of employees accidentally sharing like personally identifying information. There's protected information like HIPAA, running afoul of SOC 2. There's all these different laws and regulations that govern us, and we have to be very protective of, even compromising attorney-client privilege I could see as an issue. And these aren't hypothetical risks. I think they're real, and I think we're in charted territory, and that's happening in organizations right now quietly. There's no malicious intent, I think, as people explore these tools, but I think that's the tension. And I think there's fact that there's so many tools and no guardrails, or very few guardrails, it creates a real liability. And the thing that I think that's most tense about that is the organization's accountable for decisions it never really made, because folks are operating in the best of intentions, but in a vacuum where those decisions aren't owned in a central location. So when those employees self-select tools without oversight, the company then inherits the consequences because the company enabled that environment. So I think that's the tension, that's the worry.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think everything that you said kind of feeds into itself, like that worry grows over time. And it can lead to a lot of beliefs that may or may not be true. So, the first thing that we want to dive into is really some of the greatest AI myths in HR that we see today, starting with probably the biggest and the baddest one, which is the idea that AI is going to replace HR. So, I know that this is one of the biggest fears that we're seeing, not just across HR, but nearly across every function in the business. And so, Bernard, I want you to talk about why HR is hit harder than most functions with this myth.
Yeah, I mean, that's top of mind for a lot of people. I think anyone who hears about AI in HR, there are some folks who might say AI is taking jobs. It raises questions, concerns, and hesitations. And I think it's rightfully so. And I think to some people, like bringing AI in is like bringing a wolf into the henhouse. Like, why would you do that? Why would you have something in here that could take away my job? And I understand that hesitation, but people are complex. HR work is complex, it's deeply relational. And so I don't think when there's real people involved, there's real emotions, real stakes, I don't think any algorithm is going to fix that anytime soon because the complexity of the human experience is just so varied that AI will never get it. And so I don't think HR could ever be replaced by AI. I hear automation, right? And I hear efficiency. And so, and I think when I think some folks hear efficiency, they might hear job elimination. But I really think it's understanding and it's a mindset because the fear is founded, and I do think that deserves to be acknowledged. But AI cannot replace people because people are at the center of all of it. I think at the end of the day, with AI appropriately enabled, HR professionals can show up for the work that actually requires them, like being a strategic partner to the business, enabling others, thinking about the through line of the employee experience. Because at its core, AI is just a tool. Like to me, this is another hammer or another screwdriver. Throughout the history of time, we've always had tools to help us work smarter and faster. And I'm sure at the time, if you were a carpenter and you introduced a new hammer, that might have been threatening. Or there are some carpenters who probably saw it and said, this is a wonderful tool that allows me to do my job that much better. So I think a lot of what HR does, the transactional stuff, the repetitive stuff, the administrative stuff, the perpetual busy work, that can be more or less automated. And now you can focus on the strategic level work. And I don't think we should fear tools. Those are the tools of the trade. We need to figure out how to leverage them. And so I don't view AI as a threat to the profession. I think it's optimization.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm wondering, Lisa, technically speaking, where does AI stop being useful without humans?
Yeah. I want to pull on that thread a little bit that Bernard started about looking at AI as a tool. It really does add efficiency, and it helps us, I think, to do our jobs better, not replace us. So if we think about what AI is really good at, AI is really good at processing large volumes of data. So if you think about like open enrollment, where you have thousands of elections, dependents, coverage changes, you can use AI to look for errors without having to manually look at each one of those. Or AI is great at recognizing patterns across populations. So if you think about an HR representative looking at the entire workforce, and they notice that AI helps to bring up that there's a large number of voluntary turnover in a particular region. HR can jump in the middle of that before they start seeing it show up in exit interviews. AI can help surface information at the right moment, like thinking about performance review time. You can use AI to help bring information about employees that can help with those performance conversations. Like an example might be, maybe you see an employee hasn't had a merit increase for 2 cycles and now they're paid below market. These are just ways that, you can use AI to help bring that human side to the to what we do. But where AI hits a wall is that it doesn't have context for what it does. So it'll help us with all this processing, helps us look at data, but it can't tell you why something is happening. So if we use an example like leave, let's say that AI helps surface an employee who has taken intermittent leave, maybe like 11 times over 90 days. What AI can't tell you is that the person is caring for a terminally ill parent, or that they're a high performer, or maybe they've had some challenges with their manager being inflexible with the time they need off. AI can't see any of that context. And that's where the HR human side is really necessary to bring in the compassion for what our employees need. So I don't think AI is going to replace HR. It's just going to make the job easier so that they can focus on those human parts of the job.
Yeah, those are really helpful examples. So really it's capable of accelerating parts of HR, but it's not really capable of replacing HR. And I think, Lisa, that's a great transition into our second myth, which is that AI automatically creates bias. I'm wondering, Brian, where does bias actually enter AI systems?
Sure. Yeah, bias in AI for HR typically enters at three levels. There's data from historical patterns, objectives, which are what we're choosing to optimize, and context, how the AI affects decisions. So from the data perspective, it's really about what the system learns from. HR data reflects historical decisions and structures. Performance reviews, for example, may contain subjective bias. Promotion and pay histories may reflect unequal access to opportunity. Disciplinary actions may not be evenly distributed. Resume features for like school employment gaps or keywords can act as demographic proxies. And removing some of this data, like race or gender, doesn't necessarily remove all of the proxy effects. So if historical data reflects inequity, the model will learn those patterns. And next is objectives, what the system is optimizing for. If we're using AI for prediction, which is a typical HR use case, what is it that we're predicting? High performance, leadership potential, retention, or cultural fit. These labels are typically based on past definitions of success, and AI learns what the organization has rewarded, not necessarily what it should reward. So if there's past inequity, it can be carried on. And most systems are just optimized for accuracy, which can mask subgroup disparities. So bias, a biased definition of success can lead to biased predictions. And the last point is context, which is how the system is used. Managers often overtrust the AI rankings, or advisory tools may be misused as hard filters instead of just advisory. Subgroup outcomes, if they aren't measured, disparities can go unnoticed. And the feedback loops can kind of compound impact. So if hiring recommendations shape who gets hired, or promotion scores shape who gets opportunities for promotion, then these can affect future data and future decisions and create a cycle. So even a technically sound model can create inequitable outcomes depending on how it's deployed and governed. So I would say that AI rarely invents bias. It tends to codify and amplify bias patterns that already exist in process and data.
Yeah, that's a great point. Lisa, I'm wondering, what is the difference between governed AI, or that sound system that Brian is talking about, and unchecked automation?
Mhm. Yeah, unchecked automation is where a process just runs end to end and there's nobody held accountable to it. There's nobody who's looking at it and making decisions along the way. It's just a process, it just runs and finishes. Governed AI, this is where you really want to focus on having a process that's transparent, that it can be audited, and it's designed with review points. So what I mean by that is auditability means that you can trace a decision back to its source. You can see who set the rules and what data was used. You want to have review points so that you have a process that's designed with deliberate moments where a human can intervene, they can ask questions, they can override if necessary. And then you always want to have accountability. So somebody who's responsible for the output and not just waiting for something to go wrong before they step in and figure out what happened. Just an example of what a governed system would look like. If you have a system that maybe it looks to see when people are absent from work, rather than have this be a conditional rule that might flag something that might create a performance event, you would instead want to bring this up to an HR employee to look at with the data around it to make a decision with all the context of, is there a problem? Is there not? Is there another action to be taken?
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like the biggest takeaway from what you and Brian are saying is that bias isn't eliminated by just avoiding AI, but it can be reduced by designing oversight. And I think that really leads into our third myth, which is the idea that automation creates more errors in an HR system, not necessarily less. I'm wondering, Bernard, why do errors often increase in manual HR processes?
Yeah, I think honestly, it comes down to the fact that human beings aren't built for high volume, repetitive data loops. I think we're naturally creative problem solvers. And when you force a person to like a machine like role, the human element could become a liability. So, statistically speaking, I think when I was researching and thinking about this conversation, manual data entry carries an error rate about 1 to 5%. So when you're doing thousands and thousands of records, it's a mathematical probability that you're going to make some type of error, right? So I think it stems from three reasons that this happens: is like cognitive load and fatigue. So I think a lot of times, if you're doing something boring, it's a focus killer, or maybe you're sleep deprived because you stayed up too late. Our brains are going to drift. Those tasks are going to be that are monotonous and repetitive. You're going to make some mistakes. I think there's context switching. Like for me, I keep lots and lots of tabs open on my computer, and I'm jumping from one thing to another because I'm trying to be really productive. But when you're interrupted or you have to go to a meeting and then try to pick back up the work, maybe that spreadsheet you're working on, the numbers get transposed, or maybe the formula gets broken. So now there's an error you don't see, and then you put that into a memo, then now it's incorrect. That context switching could create more errors. Then there's the speed versus accuracy. Maybe you're trying to get a lot done really, really fast. You're under a time crunch, a deadline that you may or may not meet. You may subconsciously prioritize done over perfect. And I think sometimes with HR work, I'm not going to say you need to be perfect, but you need to be doggone close, just because you're dealing with people. So in a manual environment, there's no safety net to catch a slip up, or when someone's like, you're rushing to meet a payroll deadline, you need to get these things right because everybody's going to get paid. And I think if you don't pay people right, they're going to get upset, rightly so. So I think even the most well-intentioned person can't beat those odds forever. Nobody is perfect, but I think with automation, that could help eliminate or reduce greatly those inconsistencies. And I think AI is a great byproduct. The uses of AI as a great byproduct is the automation and less erroneous files, less errors, and I think a greater experience.
Yeah, you're definitely calling me out on the 1 million tabs. I'm also wondering from you, when HR is using AI, what really reduces those errors in practice?
Yeah, early in my HR career, I used to have templates and tools, like things that I knew were like codified, solid answers. That I remember, this is years ago. I used to work at the Society for Human Resource Management, and a lot of the SHRM members would reach out to me, and there was canned answers that worked really well that I could then spit it out really, really fast. Once I defined those answers, I would then return to it and like use that answer again and again. And the members would say, "Oh, thank you, Bernard. That was so helpful." I think with automation, like that was pre-automation and AI. Now you can have that repository of answers that actually is going to put out high quality answers or whatever it is that people are seeking, and it helps reduce errors. It gives people the correct answer, cuts down on time that would have taken to respond and write or crafting a whole new response. So like all those little fixes shave time off of my day where I can then focus on, I want to consider the things that are most strategic to the organization. So it's freeing me up from the mundane, and I get to do more interesting work, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that myth often stems from like this idea of control. And that really brings us to the fourth myth that we want to talk about, which is a scary one and an important one, that AI means losing control for your teams. Bernard, what does losing control actually look like and feel like in an HR role?
That's a great question. I think in the HR role, it's so obviously HR helps with the policies and the processes and puts them in place. We write our handbooks. And so it's a big part of the function is enforcement of those policies. And I think losing control could feel like being accountable again without authority because these tools are happening whether you know it or not. And even though I see AI as a tool and an enabler, um, I think we should look at it as AI gets more control over the orchestration. Like you're able to automate repetitive tasks, you could do more meaningful things. Um, so I think I think it's a mindset shift in terms of you're not giving up control. You're creating more orchestration of your, of your environment. I hear people talking about HR is going to be managing people and agents, but that's orchestration in and of itself. And I think there's also a fear that AI is going to replace judgment. And I think applied knowledge is what our sweet spot is as HR professionals. I think it reduces noise, AI that is. So that way I can apply more of that knowledge that I've built up over these years to then apply it to the use cases of employees having some type of issue, or maybe there's benefits questions or things like that, or more complex things, which requires, as you all said, context. And I think that's where the control and orchestration comes in. So to me, AI, again, is a tool that's an enabler that helps free me up to like coach somebody or design talent strategy or make a complex call on an employee relations issue. But I think the span of control doesn't necessarily shrink. It makes the administrative oversight that much easier. And then you can have more strategic influence to that orchestration that I was talking about.
Yeah, that's a great point. Lisa, I'm wondering, how should HR be adopting AI to prevent losing that control?
Yeah. By ensuring that humans approve, they have the ability to override or escalate at predefined moments. I think it's important to remember at the end of the day, AI is a great support tool, but it should never replace decision-making capabilities. So I say start small with low-stake automations. Build trust in a tool by automating things where the consequences are of low or minimal consequences, like maybe something like auto routing new hire paperwork or sending out policy acknowledgement reminders. And then once you get more comfortable with that, then you can start looking at orchestration where you define handoff points before you even deploy. So meaning map out your process flow that you're thinking about and really think about where are those decision points where a human needs to intervene. If you do that up front, then you're making sure you're not giving up that control or creating that problem that you have to go track down. How did a system do something without a person involved? And then finally, transparency is really important. HR knows this better than all of us, that trust can erode quickly. And so we need to make sure that we can explain why a decision was made, who made the decision, what was used to make that decision to keep that trust.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great point. I'm curious, Brian, do you have anything to add to that from that security perspective as well?
Sure. Yeah, I'd add that control doesn't come from slowing AI down. It comes from designing it well. So when roles and decision rights and review checkpoints are clearly defined, AI actually increases transparency. And when you can see how decisions are being made and where exceptions occur and where intervention is needed, that visibility often gives HR more control than the manual processes ever did.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think these decisions can create that sort of ripple effect that impacts employee experience, which I think is really, especially Bernard, what you've been getting at. And I think that ties to our fifth and final myth that we want to explore today, which is the idea that AI erodes culture. Bernard, how important is culture to your team and where does it actually show up for your employees?
Yeah, I think for my team at Descript and any place I've ever worked, culture is the currency of every company. Um, it creates coherence, and it's an ongoing process that requires everyone to do their part. Because again, I talk about the through line of the employee experience, but like what brought you here? What was your experience while you're here? Ultimately, until someone leaves, like what is that experience? But it's really thinking about that entire um, continuum. And so I don't think AI can erode culture. I think people do. Because people own the culture. We might own different percentages. A leader might own a bit more because of span of control. But we all, as people, own the culture and we play a part in making sure that um, things enhance the culture. So I see, again, AI as an enabler, and then done well, it frees us all up to have greater culture cultivation. And what I mean by that is, again, taking those administrative tasks off my to-do list frees me up to do more employee engagement efforts. Because I think employee engagement, connection, you think about the complexity of the workplace. We have hybrid workplaces, you have remote. You need to think about how you cultivate, I would say, togetherness and inclusion. And so maybe there's catching up with somebody in the hallway, or putting events together. And I'll use an example of the script. Like, we are an AI video editing tool, and we have thousands upon thousands of customers who use it on a daily basis to create video and to be the creative souls that they are. We do the same thing at work. We have like themed contests where people get to use the product, and we kind of dog food off of what we share with the world in terms of our product. But it also brings us together. Like, I'll use one for example that we do in HR. We your first 2 weeks working at the script, we have you go through the regular onboarding that most people would experience, but we also have a thing called the Descript Bootcamp, and you get to see how to use the script. You get to get in the user's shoes and understand how all the different features and products and developments are used. And then we ask people to make a 2-minute video, introducing themselves on a topic of whatever they want to talk about. But it allows me to get to know somebody, whether they're to my left or my right, or virtually in New York or some other place in the country. And it allows me, through the tool, understand my colleagues that much better. And then we have all these other opportunities to do these different contests. Like, we'll do something at Halloween, we'll do different themes, but it allows us to, one, again, use the product, but also collaborate and get to know one another. And I think, again, that's all enabled by AI, freeing up time to then allow us to have these moments of community connection, which I think obviously enhances our culture.
Yeah, I think that's great. Like, using AI as a tool to allow you to reinforce care and culture in your organization, and not just that focus on efficiency that I think we talk about a lot. Yeah, that was a great discussion. I really appreciate you all's perspective. I feel like we've learned a lot during this time, and one of the core themes that I'll take away for sure is that AI is really a support tool, not a decision-making tool, as Lisa emphasized a million times, and so did everyone else, and thank you for that. I think it's important to note that AI can really help HR save time, and we should be paying attention to where people teams should still own the process from start to finish. And so I want us to take a minute and just take a look at this idea of the human checkpoint model and how it can be used as a takeaway from all of you all listening. So the human checkpoint model really exists to answer one question, which is who decides and when. Really, it's breaking down the idea that AI is surfacing information. There are systems that are actually enforcing the rules, but ultimately, HR is the final authority. So I wanted to hear a little bit from you, Brian, thinking about this human checkpoint model and what it means from your stance.
Sure. From a governance standpoint, the human checkpoint for decisions is really what creates defensibility. When you can clearly show who reviewed a decision, what information was considered, where the AI supported but did not replace human judgment, you reduce legal exposure and you strengthen compliance. Especially in areas like leave management, where decisions directly affect someone's livelihood and their well-being. Documenting human oversight isn't just a good practice, it's really essential risk management.
Yeah. Bernard, is there anything you want to add to that from the HR perspective?
Yeah, as everyone was talking, I was thinking the human checkpoint model is really important, but it's also a function of partnership, because I think with my co-panelists here, you have to work in partnership for the human checkpoint to work, because everyone has their roles and responsibilities in making sure that the rules are defined and that it's well governed, and that framework of policies in place protects employees and maintains company trust. Because I think we use AI in so many different ways, like recruiting, onboarding, performance management, employee engagement, you name it. It touches every part of the employee life cycle. So that partnership is super critical in making sure the human checkpoints are happening. Because again, the context, the governance are really important. Because when I think about this, we're like an inflection point. And I, as an HR practitioner, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop to see some big company with lax checkpoints kind of being a cautionary tale of what not to do. So I think it's a matter of when. But I think the human checkpoint could help alleviate a lot of that through that just smart partnerships and making sure that we're proactively working with one another to make sure like the trust isn't lost, and that way you're also protecting your employees, but also the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Lisa, is there anything you want to add to that before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, just to round out with both Brian and Bernard were sharing, responsible AI isn't just about the technology and what it can do. It's the structure that we build around it. It's the checkpoints, the oversight, the accountability, and all of that is the HR function. and where the human will continue to stay in the model.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth noting that AI should never send, approve, enforce outcomes without human sign off. I think that's a super important point. You want to make sure that we drive home with anyone watching. As an HR leader, you play such an important role in creating the culture of your organization. And one of those places that relates back to Tilt is in the area of managing leave. So we're going to take a minute and just talk about how leave is a perfect example of applying guardrails when it comes to applying AI, because it's high volume, it's high stakes, and it's often a very emotionally charged moment in the employee experience too. I'm wondering, Bernard, how do you think about AI and leave specifically in the HR arena?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when it comes to leave, and using Tilt, and I think it's a time saver, right? Like, so I think just like a higher level, AI reduces the admin, but HR does retain the judgment. But AI can handle the heavy lifting. Like when I think in prior roles, the leave management system was so manual and so difficult. And we talked earlier about like error. It was prone with errors and coordination. And I think AI can do the heavy lifting for you, like tracking eligibility, flagging FMLA timelines, sending reminders, surfacing the right forms. And like those things used to get tons and tons of time. And there were a lot of gray areas. But again, like I think the part where the strategic part of HR is explaining the process, understanding people's concerns, that context, the accommodation requests, like all the different pieces, the discretion. So I think the work stays with HR. I think I would say like AI in itself is like a lubricant to smooth the process to get you those decisions faster. But a real person still makes the call, because when you think about leave, having a child, going out for medical reasons that are difficult, these are all different and challenging due to that context. So I think that's the sweet spot. And I think in terms of leave management, it makes it that much better than it was just 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Anything you want to add to that, Lisa?
Yeah, we talk about guardrails in the abstract quite a lot. So let me give you an example of what it actually looks like. Here at Tilt, we have a feature called Tilly Voice, and it's an AI tool that we have intentionally limited. So it's a tool that works from a curated FMLA knowledge base, and it gives general compliance information. But as soon as a question has a question that needs a real case level judgment, it hands it off to a human. So we built this in to intentionally not let the AI do any guessing, not to have any overreaching. We just have this clear, clean escalation point that it goes to a human that can actually help and get the information to the employee or HR. And this is a model in practice where we're letting AI do what it's really good at. So looking at a knowledge base and serving up an answer, but knowing when to stop, using that context, real case level judgment that's needed by an HR person.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I work with and think a lot about Tilly Voice, and I often think about how our customers appreciate that sort of escalation path and making sure that it's not overstepping. So let's take some of this information and see how HR can really apply it to their day to day. There are 3 simple ways that we think HR can begin adopting AI into their team. And it's really important to emphasize that beginning to implement AI doesn't require a huge leap of faith or completely reshaping your organization or your team and how you do things. These are really low barrier practical steps that you can take as soon as today. So I'm going to hand it off to Bernard and then get to Lisa and Brian for our last point here.
Yeah, I think starting small. I remember when I first got introduced to it, my daughter introduced me to like ChatGPT a few years ago, and then I've been using different tools ever since. But I say start with low risk use cases to build confidence. So right now, I'm playing around with Claude Code and Lovable because we could do almost anything in building low level apps. And I find the prompting process is really a wonderful thought exercise to experiment, explore like what's possible in an environment that's low stakes. Because I think for so many years as an HR professional, there's things that I wanted, but it couldn't happen. But now you can create those possibilities and do those small experiments using Claude Code or whatever your favorite tool is. And I think the better you get at prompting, the better you can see what's possible out there and what's capable with the litany of the AI tools that exist right now. So I would say just start small and see what you always wish could be, and then just do it.
Yeah, so I will recommend partnering early. So we're all still learning and experimenting, but we shouldn't do it alone. So, we have legal who can help make sure that your business is staying compliant. You have HR who understands the people and the people side of the things that we're doing. And then, of course, you've got engineering that can understand what the tool can do and help make it happen. And the sooner you bring all of these individuals together to help define solutions, you'll have a cleaner, safer implementation.
Yeah, and lastly, I'll say, keep humans in the loop. Intentionally design systems where humans make key decisions and not just intervene. I think we've already, covered the importance of human decision making and human in the loop. So I won't reiterate it, but I'll emphasize how important it is.
Yeah, I think no problem with beating a dead horse there. It's super important. So thanks for bringing it up again. To get a greater breakdown of these steps, you can actually scan this QR code and get access to our free white paper. And that will also be available as a follow-up after this call. So we're going to take a moment and let me set myself up correctly. And we're going to transition to Q&A. Okay, so any of you all can take this Q&A, so feel free to step in if it feels appropriate. The first question we have is, outside of ChatGPT, what other tools have you found to be helpful when saving time and making HR more efficient?
Well, I already mentioned I like Claude Code. Like I remember I was at an event and somebody introduced me to Claude Code in late 2020, or Claude in and of itself in 2023, and I've been using Claude ever since. So that's my favorite tool. And now that it has somewhat of memory, there's repetitive tasks that I do. Like I might do a weekly update. So I can ask it to pull from my daily updates and create a weekly recap. And it just saves me a lot of time. So that's like a repetitive task that I don't have to spend time doing. And then I mentioned before, taking Claude Code and putting it into Lovable. Lovable is really neat. It gives you free credits and you can build whatever you're thinking. So you might say some wild stuff in the Claude Code, it comes up with the code, you drop it in a Lovable and it exists. And all you have to do is publish it. So I think it's neat. You just have to be careful again about governance and what you're putting in there. So I think it's very surface level things. We also use Gemini. And so I think it's already built into the G Suite that we use at our offices. So you might say, refine this email, or it might help me with fabricating or creating an email or response. So those all time savers. So those are things that I use on a daily basis, Gemini, Claude. We also use Notion, which is an amazing AI empowered tool. So a lot of our tech stack is already AI empowered. I always encourage people, look under the engine and look under the hood and see what exists, because a lot of times these enablements are happening so quickly that you may not even know what the resources that you have at your fingertips.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and a lot of good ideas in there. I need to experiment with some of those. You're probably far ahead of me, Bernard, but we'll get there. Here is a second question from our group. What should training look like when bringing in an AI solution? Or once you have a vetted, safe solution, what parameters do you set to ensure that the solution stays safe? That's a really good one. Brian, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think the training depends on, the solution and what it's looking to accomplish. But as Lisa mentioned, with our Tilly voice, we decided to do a very contained data set that we trained it on. I think, there's the broader the data set, the more risk. And certainly if you just open it up to like anything on the internet that it's being trained on, you're really exposing yourself to, potentially inaccurate data or misleading data or outdated data. So, starting with good data sets, and then looking at, through testing, looking at the outputs, and not just from a safety perspective, but also from a bias perspective, since we talked on that before. intentionally thinking about some potential bias use cases and looking to see, if maybe minority groups are underrepresented in some way, and that the output is really as expected. And it's not just accurate for data in, data out, but it's, truly encompassing the goals and missions that you're looking to accomplish as an HR team.
Yeah, that's a great point. Anything you want to add to that, Lisa? You don't have to, but you were mentioned, so I want to give you a chance.
Brian did a great job on it. He's designed the governance here at Tilt, and so he's got a good handle on it.
Okay, perfect.
Speaking of governance, I'll add one to the previous
Yep.
question too, that just kind of top of mind as we were talking through it, which is, as you look to use tools like ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini, there is a difference in the contractual terms between licensed enterprise versions and the free versions that are available to anyone on the internet. So be careful about what sensitive data you put out into the free versions. They might not have the data training and privacy that you expect. So hopefully you're working with your security teams on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Double click on the partnership piece that Lisa was talking about earlier. That's super helpful, Brian. So our third and final question is, where do you see AI helping HR the most within the next year? Is there anything we should be preparing for that hasn't been covered yet?
I went to an interesting roundtable last night talking about AI and talent. And one of the topics of conversation was, and I think this is a short-sighted thing that we're seeing, is because of AI, I think we're seeing a lot of folks focusing on mid-career and more senior leaders, and we're not focusing on early career. And I think they're the next up. And if we don't focus on how we can connect where we are currently to the emerging early career folks, we're going to have a noticeable gap in terms of qualified talent who could take the helm or take the steering wheel in a couple of years. And I feel like we're being a little bit short-sighted by shortchanging the up-and-comers, because they won't be technically proficient enough to be able to keep us competitive. And I think otherwise you'll see companies just poaching from one another instead of developing the next folks who should be coming up. So I think HR should be thinking about emerging talent and bridging the gap between what you're doing in corporate America and what you're doing in colleges, so that way they are more in sync. And so that way those folks come up, they are ready and equipped versus being on the back foot. So I think emerging talent is what HR should be thinking about, not just expecting AI to fix everything, but really thinking about cultivating the next crop of employees in the workforce.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. As we're talking about developing all of our own skills around AI, there's a whole group of people that are entering the workforce at a really confusing moment. So I think there's a ton of work to be done there. That's a great point. So that is our final question. Thank you all so much for being on this panel. Thank you to everyone who's attended. If you'd like to stay connected to us, here's our names and emails if you have any questions after the fact. And if any other questions show up in the chat, we'll make sure to follow up with you all. Thank you again. This was a great discussion.